So we're going to get a lot of chances to look at phylogenies and to make phylogenies in lab, but if this is a pretty challenging concept, and so if you are looking for some online help, then you can check out some of these websites that I have posted here. What I did to find these websites is I did a search for how to construct a cladogram, which you'll learn about in lab. A cladogram is just a special kind of phylogeny. So I do strongly recommend that if you're struggling with these concepts, that you go on the internet and learn a little bit more about it. Okay, so one of the things that phylogenies teach us, when you really start to understand that that they are showing the evolutionary history, is that everything is related to each other. We are all one big happy family. We all have things in common. I mean, for example, all living things are made up of cells, right? So that means that if you inherit your cells from your ancestor, and if you go back far enough in time, you're going to come across, well, you're going to cross the ancestor to everything because something had a cell and passed that trait on to the offspring. So that's where you'd find the common ancestor to all life on Earth, right here on this cladogram, or this phylogeny. And this is the lineage that led to bacteria, and this is the lineage that led to everything else. And here we are, the lineage that led to archaea and everything else. One of the interesting things that you might notice about this phylogeny is that you see protists on here 3 times, and that is, it's kind of a new thing to do this. That's because we've been using DNA and other techniques to group organisms together, and it turns out that there are a lot of protists that are really similar to plants, and there's a lot of protists that are really similar to animals, and there's a lot of protists that aren't really that similar to either one. And so we actually are probably in the future not even going to be using the term protists. We're going to be using some other term. So for now, we have protists being located in 3 different places on the evolutionary tree of life. Also, notice this group animals right here, that can be further subdivided into like all of the different animals, and they all have their own evolutionary relationships. So you could kind of take this phylogeny that we looked at just a second ago and plop it right there, and you'd have further branches. So there are over 1.5 million species that have been described on this planet. And so if you think about like 1.5 million branches, you start to get an idea of how very messy these phylogenies can end up looking. That's why we only show you the small portions of them. All right, so when we're analyzing these phylogenies, one of the key things to analyze for is something called the monophyletic group. So a monophyletic group is a little confusing at first, but basically a monophyletic group is any group on a phylogeny that where the individuals of the group share a common ancestor, and the group contains all of the descendants of that common ancestor. So if we're looking at mammals, lizards, crocodiles, and birds, and we look at this phylogeny, if we say, okay, this phylogeny says that birds and crocodiles share a common ancestor right here, and that lizards share a common ancestor with the group birds and crocodiles, you might start to see something really confusing, because what this phylogeny is saying is that crocodiles and birds are a monophyletic group. They are a group that share a common ancestor, and this ancestor includes all of the descendants. We would call these 2 things a monophyletic group. That's a little strange because we're used to lumping crocodiles with lizards, but that's not what this phylogeny is saying. It's saying that crocodiles and lizards are not a monophyletic group. they don't and should not be just naturally kind of lumped together because they don't have as much in common with each other as birds do with crocodiles. And I know what you're thinking, feathers, right? But it turns out that if you look at more than just the feathers, birds and crocodiles have a lot in common. And they have less in common with each other than they do with the lizards. Did I say that right? Hopefully. Even less in common with mammals. So monophyletic groups are more important because it lets us say, well, maybe we shouldn't be thinking of lizards and crocodiles as a group. They don't share a common, well, they do share a common ancestor, but the common ancestor includes lizards, crocodiles, but it also includes birds. And since this box is not including birds in the group, we have to say that this box is not monophyletic. But this one is. And if I wanted to draw a bigger box, I could say that this whole set here of birds, crocodiles, and lizards are all monophyletic. So that's the concept. We'll be dealing with this a little bit more in class and in lab. But let's move on now to just take a quick look at what we base evolutionary trees on. And there's a couple of different things that we base it on. The first is we're going to do comparative anatomy, or morphology is another way to say that. So we've got these 4 organisms sitting in front of you. We've got this African lion, the spotted hyena, the black bear, and the gray wolf. And if you were just to look at these pictures, what 2 species would you say, just based on how they look on the surface, which 2 would you say were the most similar? And a lot of people tend to group the gray wolf with the spotted hyena. And that's based in a lot of part what you know about them, like they both hunt in packs, right? They kind of yip and howl, and so people tend to think that they're very, very similar. However, I want to remind you that if you could remember the lesson of biogeography, which says that things that live near each other tend to be more closely related to each other, you might have realized that, in fact, the spotted hyena is actually more closely related to a lion than it is to a wolf. And in fact, hyenas are a type of cat. The black bear lives in North America, as does the gray wolf, and those 2 are more closely related. But that's biogeography. We're trying to focus here on comparative anatomy. And so let's compare some anatomy. It turns out that African lions and spotted hyenas have retractable claws, and black bears and gray wolves don't. So that's one thing that lumps these 2 together and these not. We could look at some esoteric kind of things like the number of chambers in their ear bones. These guys have 2 chambers, these guys only have 1 chamber. And then, kind of hilariously, does the penis have a bone? And these cats do not have a bone in their penis, but these bear and gray wolves do have a bone in their penis. And so if you are just kind of thinking about how you should lump these guys together, it's very clear that just based on this anatomy and biogeography, that the black bear is more closely related to the gray wolf, and the African lion is more closely related to the spotted hyena. Right? They do share a common ancestor farther back in time, but we're talking about more closely related and more closely related. We can also use DNA and proteins and all kinds of different molecules to look at the same kind of story. So using color coding here, where A's are blue and T's are pink and C's are yellow and G's are green, this is DNA. And just doing a quick visual here, you can kind of see that this species is pretty closely related to this species. There's just a couple of quick differences there. And if you look over on this side, there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 differences between these 2 species in the DNA level. So they're pretty closely related. But I have to say, they're not as closely related to each other as these 2 are, because there's only 2 differences. And what that means is that these guys actually have a more recent common ancestor. Remember, this is the axis of time. These 2 species have a more recent common ancestor than these 2 species do, because it takes longer to accumulate mutations. If we wanted to compare the two groups, species 3 and 4 as a group, comparing to species 1 and 2, you can look at all the differences that there are between them. And there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 differences between these two groups, which means that they had a common ancestor. I mean, they do still have similarities, right? You can see the similarities. They have a common ancestor even farther back in time. So DNA is a really, really powerful tool for looking at how organisms are related, how closely related, and this is the first time that we've been able to actually differentiate between how just how closely related they are. These ones have a more recent common ancestor, these guys have a little bit more distant common ancestor, and the common ancestor back here is even more distant. So DNA lets us put time on our, or like a really relative time on our axes. So I just thought I'd ask you a quick question here, because I like this question. Let's just imagine that we still have these 4 species, but we add a 5th species. And where would this species go? Like, who would it be most closely related to? So we discover a new mammal that has no retractable claws. It has a penis bone. It has a 1 chamber in the ear bone, and it hunts in packs. Which answer is the most closely related? Is it the African lion, the spotted hyena, the gray wolf, or the black bear? Take a second. Think about it. You can always pause the video. But, of course, I would put it closest to the gray wolf because it's got everything in common with the gray wolf and the idea that it hunts in packs. Well, we're almost done with our lecture. We only have a few more slides left, about 5 left. And so just a few more concepts for you, like this one. There are some structures that you can use very easily in phylogenies, and there are some structures that you should avoid using in phylogenies. And that's because similar structures don't always reveal a common ancestor. For example, you've got this bat with these lovely wings right here, and you've got this insect with some more lovely wings right here, and you might think that they got their wings and their wings from an ancestor that had wings. But if you thought that, you would actually be incorrect, because wings is been evolved independently in the lineage that led to insects, and it evolved independently in the lineage that led to bats. So imagine back here this common ancestor of all these animals, the insects, the fish, the birds, the bats, and the humans. Did this ancestor have wings? And the answer, I hope that you understand that the answer is no, this ancestor did not have wings. It led to too many other organisms that don't have wings. So this was a wingless ancestor. Wings evolved here, and then they evolved here, and then they evolved here, but not here. So there is a type of characteristic called an analogous characteristic or an analogous structure that evolves independently through a process called convergent evolution. And we talked about that in the last chapter, in chapter 8, but we're now applying this to the phylogenies that we're learning about in chapter 10. All right, so this could never be more interesting and clear than it is if you start looking at these 3 organisms. So this is the common shrew. You'd find that in North America. This is the African golden mole, which looks an awful lot like the common shrew. And this is the African elephant. Now, again, if you understood biogeography, you would immediately be saying, well, maybe the African elephant and the African golden mole are more closely related. And, you know, I'm really hoping that that's what you were thinking, and not falling into the trap that biologists fell into for a really long time, which was putting the common shrew and the African golden mole together. I mean, look at them. They look so very similar. They have teeny tiny eyes, or no eyes in the case of this guy. This big sensitive nose, little little naked fingers for digging. They're just really, really streamlined. In fact, we didn't understand how closely related the African golden mole was to the African elephant until we started looking at DNA sequences. And it turns out that these two have a lot of DNA in common. So, I mean, that just should be blowing your mind right now. It did the first time I learned about that. That was just really cool. So, to sum up, you cannot always rely on characteristics that make things look similar to each other because maybe they look similar to each other just because they have similar niches. Maybe they look similar to each other because they live in similar environments and are dealing with adapting to those environments in a similar way. Okay, last big topic, and this is the topic of macroevolution. Macroevolution simply means large-scale evolution. It means how species can change so dramatically over time, like we've been looking at those phylogenies. So let's take a look at trying to understand the differences and the similarities between macroevolution, which are those accumulated large-scale effects, and microevolution, which are these slight changes in allele frequency that we learned about back in chapter 8. So, here's what I'm going to tell you. There is no difference between microevolution and macroevolution, except for the amount of time that is going by. The processes that occur in microevolution are exactly the same processes that lead to macroevolution, but you have a heck of a lot more time. It's just time. There is no other difference. So I'm sorry for those of you who think that you can kind of quote unquote believe in microevolution, but you don't quote unquote believe in macroevolution. If you think that microevolution is something that's valuable and viable and reasonable, then just add a little bit more time and you will get macroevolution. Just like, and this is a nice analogy that your book uses, the Grand Canyon forming. That Grand Canyon didn't take place overnight. It was these slow, gradual erosion events that eventually led to this amazing thing that we call the Grand Canyon. Just like it's these slow, slight changes in allele frequency from one generation to the next that have acted on over a really long period of time can lead to these very dramatic differences in end results. Of course, not all evolution is slow and constant. It can be kind of rapid. I mean, like think about the sympatric speciation that we already talked about. Sympatric speciation is a very, very quick speciation if it happens by polyploidy. I mean, you're talking about one generation and you've got a new species. So the tempo of evolution can be quick. The fossil record tends to favor showing these slow, gradual processes. Like we tend to see these kinds of things really slow and gradually, but that's not the only lines of evidence that we see. In fact, we just call this gradual change. That's kind of what Darwin said. But if we look at some of other fossils, what we see are things that seem to stay the same for a really long period of time, millions and millions of years, and then all of a sudden it seems to jump to a new version of it. But of course, those are millions of years going on there, right? In that shorter, if you kind of zoom in up there, that if you look at the changes that are happening, you would still be able to see those changes. But those changes are not really captured as easily in the fossil record. Then we see this long period of stasis, not changing, followed by some seemingly rapid over the course of just like maybe 500,000 years or so. I mean, that's a long time, don't get me wrong. The change is very rapid. So we call this punctuated equilibrium. The equilibrium or the stasis, remember we learned that word equilibrium back when we were talking about Hardy and Weinberg. the equilibrium is punctuated by rather fast, over a shorter period of time, evolutionary change, followed by long periods of stasis. We tend to see punctuated equilibrium happening when the environment is not changing very fast. And then you get the punctuated part when it does change fast, and then you get some periods where the environment's not changing fast. You see gradual change when the environment is changing gradually. You're going to have gradual change among those species. There's other ways that you can get fast speciation to happen too, besides just a change in environment. And actually, that's what we're going to wrap up on. There's this idea called adaptive radiation. And if you think about adaptive radiation, which is where you start out with a small number of species and you, over a very short period of time, get a large number of species. If you think about this kind of extreme diversification, there's a few causes of this, and they are mass extinction. Yes, mass extinction can lead to a huge diversification. Then there's colonization, and finally evolutionary innovations. So let's think about this mass extinction event. You kill off a huge proportion of the animals on the planet, or the organisms on the planet, but not all of them die. Some of them survive, and the ones that survive reproduce, and there's all of these ecological niches available to move into. And so you start to get the things like we used to have very few mammals when the dinosaurs were around. I mean, there were mammals around, but not a lot of them, not a huge number of species. But there were a huge number of species of dinosaurs. When the dinosaurs went extinct, the mammals had their chance to bloom and blossom. And now we have all of these, thousands and thousands and thousands of species of mammals that would not have existed if the dinosaurs had not gone extinct. So mass extinction can lead to adaptive radiation. Colonization can do this too. If organisms move to a new location where there's abundant resources and less competition, you can start to get rapid diversification and rapid speciation in those new locations. And then finally, evolutionary innovations can also lead to adaptive radiation. For example, the wings of insects, that was a huge innovation. It allowed insects to not only escape predators, but to also fly and find new sources of food. And so we now actually know that the most abundant group, the group with the most number of species on this entire planet, are the insects. There are more species of beetles on this planet than there are species of all plants. I mean, that should be blowing your mind. There's 800,000 or so species of beetles. It's kind of crazy. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed learning about evolution, and I will see you in class.